The tractor that everyone in Mercer County, Kentucky laughed about in the spring of 1974 was a 1952 Farmall Super M that Roy Callahan had dragged out of the back of his father-in-law's barn on a Saturday morning in March with 2 flat tires and a seized engine and a sheet metal hood that had been used at some point in the previous decade as a surface for cutting pipe, and that showed every inch of that use. He was a methodical man in the specific way that farming produces methodical people, through years of work that rewards systematic attention and punishes improvisation through the daily contact with systems, soil and equipment and weather and markets, that either teach a man to pay attention to what is actually happening or gradually reveal the cost of not paying attention. His father-in-law, James Hartley, had told him something on the day Roy and Ellen got married in 1960 that Roy had kept for 25 years, and that still seemed to him one of the most useful things anyone had said to him about farming. James had said that the difference between a man who makes a living farming and a man who doesn't is not the quality of the ground or the quantity of the capital or the intelligence of the man. It's the consistency of the attention. He said that the ground will do its part every year if you do your part every year, and that doing your part every year requires attention that is consistent even when the year is difficult, especially when the year is difficult, because the difficult years are the ones that reveal whether the attention is real or only present when things are going well. Roy had farmed with that understanding for 13 years by the spring of 1974, and the 87 acres had done their part in return. Roy was 38 years old that spring, and he had been farming 87 acres outside Harrodsburg since 1961, when he and his wife Ellen had scraped together enough to make a down payment on a piece of ground that had been in the county's agricultural memory as modest but honest land, the kind of ground that produces reliably when it is treated with the consistent attention that modest ground requires. He had been treating it with that attention for 13 years, and the 87 acres had responded the way honest ground responds, not dramatically, but consistently, year after year, in the specific way that makes a farmer believe the ground is worth the work. He had been farming with a 1948 Farmall M that he had bought when he started in 1961, which by 1974 was 26 years old and had been showing its age in the specific way that machines show their age when the maintenance has been adequate but not exceptional. The M ran. It would continue to run, with care, for some additional period that Roy estimated at another 3 to 4 years before the major systems would require attention that would cost more than the machine was worth. He needed to think about what came after the M. The obvious path was a newer tractor, something from the early 1970s production run, with more horsepower and the modern hydraulics and the closed cab that the newer equipment was offering by that point, a machine that would serve the 87 acres more capably than the M was serving them, and that would do it for another decade or more before the same question arose again. The local dealer in Harrodsburg had a used 1971 International 666 diesel that was in good shape and priced at $3,200, which was within the range of what the operation could finance without straining. Roy had looked at the 666 twice, seriously, the way a man looks at something he is considering. It was a good tractor. It would do what he needed done. He had also been thinking, through the winter of 1973 to 1974, about what it cost to farm, and what it produced, and what the margin between those two things was. and the thinking had produced in him a specific reluctance about adding any fixed cost to the operation that was not strictly necessary. The $666 at $3,200 financed was not a large cost in the absolute sense, but it was a cost, and it would be a cost every month for the duration of the financing. And Roy Callahan was by nature a man who considered whether each cost was necessary before he accepted it. The Farm magazine article that had started the thinking in January of 1974 was from a publication that Roy had been reading for about 5 years, a practical magazine aimed at farmers who were interested in the technical side of farm operation and who were willing to do more of their own mechanical work than the average farmer was doing in that era. The article was specific and well-researched, written by a man who had clearly done what he was describing, rather than simply observing it from the outside, and Roy had read it the way he read things that seemed immediately relevant to his specific situation, which was with a pencil in his hand and a notebook nearby. He had made notes from the article about the specific failure modes of the Super M platform, about the parts availability for the C264 engine, about the typical rebuild costs, and the typical service life after rebuild that documented restorations had produced. He had noted the name of a supplier in Louisville that the article mentioned as a reliable source for international harvester parts, and the name and general location of the man in Cincinnati who was doing restoration work and who had agreed to be quoted in the article about his specific experience with the Super M platform. He had also noted, specifically, the article's statement about 25 years of service from a properly rebuilt machine. He had underlined it, not because it was a promise, which it was not, but because it represented the calibration of the rebuild as an investment, the period over which the cost of the rebuild should be amortized in a comparison with the cost of newer equipment. 25 years on, 87 acres. He had worked the arithmetic in the notebook. The alternative that he had been turning over since January came from an unlikely direction. His wife, Ellen's father, a man named James Hartley, who had farmed in the next county over for 40 years before his health made it impossible, had a 1952 Farmall Super M that had been sitting in the back of his barn since 1966, when James had replaced it with a used 460 and had not gotten around to disposing of the old machine in the 8 years since. Roy had known the Super M was there. He had seen it on visits to James Hartley's farm over the years, getting a little more buried behind the things that accumulate in a barn when a man stops paying attention to one corner of it. He had not thought seriously about it as a working tractor because the superficial condition, which was poor, and the fact that it had been sitting unused for 8 years, which was discouraging, had placed it in the mental category of things that had been good once and were no longer good. But in January of 1974, he had read an article in a farm magazine about tractor restoration, about the economics of rebuilding older equipment versus purchasing newer equipment. And the article had made a specific argument about Farmall Super M tractors in particular that had lodged in his thinking. The argument was this: the Super M was one of the most mechanically sound designs that International Harvester had produced in the post-war period. The engine, AC 264 gasoline or diesel variant, was robust in the ways that matter for long service, which is to say, it was not sophisticated enough to fail in the ways that sophisticated engines fail, and it was designed with the service intervals and the tolerances that allowed a careful operator to maintain it indefinitely with available parts. The hydraulic system was straightforward. The transmission was reliable. The major failure modes were well understood and well documented in service literature that was widely available, and the parts were still made, both by International Harvester and by the aftermarket suppliers that had emerged around the Farmall M and Super M platform because the installed base was large enough to support them. The article said, specifically, that a Super M rebuilt to specification and maintained on schedule could serve a small to medium farm operation for another 25 years from the time of the rebuild. Roy had read this 3 times. He drove to his father-in-law's barn in March and looked at the Super M seriously for the first time. He spent 2 hours with it, the way he had learned over 13 years of farming to spend time with a machine you are evaluating, methodically and without rushing, looking at what the years had done to each system and making notes about what the rebuild would require and what it would cost. The engine was seized, which he had expected, from water intrusion through the exhaust stack during the years of outdoor storage before the machine had been moved to the barn. The magneto was corroded. The carburetor was varnished from the old fuel that had been left in it when the machine was parked. The hydraulic pump had seized. Both rear tires were flat and the sidewalls showed cracking from age. The sheet metal was damaged from the pipe cutting use. The hood creased and gouged in a way that would require either straightening or replacement. He looked at the engine block carefully. He looked at the bore through the spark plug holes with a flashlight, at the cylinder walls for scoring. He looked at the crankshaft journals at the oil drain. He looked at the block for cracks around the freeze plugs. He pushed a rod through the exhaust stack and felt the piston move, which it did after he had applied penetrant for an hour and worked it carefully, which told him the cylinder walls had not bonded completely to the piston rings, which meant the bore was potentially salvageable. The arithmetic sat on the kitchen table for 3 evenings before Roy made the decision. Not because the arithmetic was unclear, which it was not. The math was straightforward and the conclusion was not in doubt, but because a decision of this kind, one that goes against the direction of what the community around you is doing, and against the recommendation of the dealer who knows the market, and against the surface evidence of the machine you are considering, deserves more than a single evening's certainty. He wanted to be sure he was reading the situation correctly. He wanted to be sure the article was not overstating the durability of the rebuilt Super M, that the 25 years of service was a real outcome and not an optimistic projection. And the answer to that question came from the man in Cincinnati who had been cited in the article, and whose phone number Roy had noted. He called Walter Grimes on a Wednesday evening in February, a call he had been thinking about making for 2 weeks. Walter picked up on the 4th ring and listened to Roy's question, which was whether the 25-year service life for a properly rebuilt Super M was a real number or an approximation, and whether the rebuild costs in the article were accurate for a machine in the condition Roy described. Walter asked him to describe the condition in more detail. Roy described what he had seen at the barn in March of the previous year: the seized engine and the corroded magneto and the frozen hydraulic pump and the cracked tires and the damaged sheet metal. Walter asked specific questions about the block condition and the bore, about whether the freeze plugs showed any cracking, about whether the main journals were turning or completely frozen. Roy answered each question from the notes he had taken at the barn. Walter said the description was consistent with a machine that had been sitting in non-ideal conditions for 8 years, but that was not fundamentally compromised. He said the seized engine was the result of moisture intrusion, not of mechanical failure, and that moisture intrusion in a stored engine is addressable He said the block and bore condition Roy was describing, the ability to move the piston with penetrant after an hour, was a good sign. He said the cost estimate in the article was reasonable if the bore did not require replacement, which the bore condition Roy was describing suggested it would not. He said he had returned to service 17 Super M tractors over the previous 12 years, and that the oldest of them was now in its 14th year of post-rebuild service. He said he had no reason to doubt the 25-year figure as a real outcome for a machine rebuilt to specification and maintained on schedule. Roy thanked him and said he would probably call again once he had the machine apart. Walter said to call whenever the question arose. Roy called him 4 times during the first rebuild and twice a year for the next 20 years. He went home and did the arithmetic. The rebuild cost, as he estimated it from the article's guidance and from a phone call to an international harvester parts supplier in Louisville, was somewhere between $400 and $600 in parts, depending on what the teardown revealed about the specific condition of the worn components. His own labor was his own labor, which he priced at zero in the sense that the hours he spent rebuilding the tractor in the evenings and on Saturdays, when the weather prevented field work, were hours that had no direct alternative income attached to them. Compare that to the $3,200 for the 666, financed at the going rate in 1974, which would cost him somewhere around $3,800 total over the term of the financing. The math was straightforward. The question was whether the Super M, rebuilt, would serve the 87 acres for a reasonable period, and whether he could do the rebuild to a standard that would support that service. He believed he could do the rebuild. He had rebuilt engines before, not tractor engines specifically, but automotive engines, and the C264 was mechanically simpler than the automotive engines he had worked on. He had the tools. He had the shop, a modest structure attached to the equipment storage that was adequate for the work, if not ideal. He got the Super M running in his thinking before he got it running in the field, going through the rebuild sequence in his head over several weeks until the sequence was clear and the specific decisions about what to replace and what to restore were made. The response in the county to Roy's decision was not uniformly skeptical. Most of the conversation was skeptical because the surface of the machine was poor enough that the skepticism was reasonable. But there were 2 men in the county who had a different response. One of them was an older farmer named Harvest Dye, who was 67 in 1974, and who had been farming in Mercer County since before the war, and who had rebuilt more than one piece of equipment in his farming life when the economics of the situation made rebuilding more sensible than replacing. Harvest said nothing publicly about the Super M decision. He came to Roy's shop in June, when the rebuild was about half finished, and spent an hour looking at the work. He looked at the engine components laid out on the workbench, at the machine shop receipts for the bore and crankwork, at the parts boxes organized on the shelf. He said Roy was doing it right. Roy asked what he meant. Harvest said he had seen men try to rebuild engines without taking them to the machine shop first, without doing the precision work that the machine shop's equipment was required for, and the results had been engines that ran better than before, but not as well as they should have. Engines that had been assembled with components that were not quite right for each other because the measurements had not been done and the tolerances had not been addressed. He said taking it to the machine shop first was the difference between a rebuild and a repair, and that Roy was rebuilding. Roy said he appreciated that. Harvest left without saying more. He came back in July when the machine was finished and running, looked at it for a few minutes, and said that it looked right. Roy said he thought it was right. Harvis said he would make it to 100 if Roy kept it up. He was right by 48% as of the last check. In April of 1974, he brought the Super M home on a borrowed trailer. His neighbor to the north, a man named Don Weatherly, who farmed 120 acres with equipment that was consistently newer than the equipment on the farms around him, and who had a way of making his equipment choices a visible expression of his agricultural philosophy, saw the Super M on the trailer and said something that Roy heard from the road, and that became the quote that went around the county. Don said it was the sorriest excuse for a farm tractor he had seen since the war. Roy parked it in the shop and started working. He pulled the engine in the first weekend and had it to the machine shop in Harrodsburg on Monday. The machine shop bored 2 cylinders that had minor scoring and honed all 4 to specification. Reground the crankshaft journals that had developed slight ovality from the years of non-use stress, and resurfaced the head that had warped slightly from the thermal cycling of the years in the barn. Roy picked up the block and head on Thursday and began the rebuild on Saturday. The rebuild took 6 weekends. He replaced all of the bearings, new from the IH dealer in Lexington. He replaced the piston rings. He rebuilt the carburetor with a kit from the dealer. He replaced the fuel pump and the water pump, both with new units. He replaced all of the belts and hoses. He rebuilt the magneto, which required a Saturday spent with the service manual and 2 phone calls to a man in Cincinnati who restored old farm equipment and who turned out to be extraordinarily generous with specific technical knowledge about Farmall magneto service. He rebuilt the hydraulic pump with a kit. A Saturday morning job once he had the kit and the service procedure from the manual. He replaced both rear tires with new tires from a tire dealer in Lexington who had the correct size in stock. He straightened the sheet metal with the body tools he had for automotive work, getting the hood back to a condition that was not perfect but that was functional and respectable. He painted the tractor with Farmall red, the correct shade, which he mixed himself from a formula he found in the restoration article. He applied 3 coats in the controlled environment of the shop with the door sealed against the May wind that would have put dust in the finish. On a Saturday morning in June of 1974, he filled the fuel tank, set the choke, and cranked the Super M. It started on the 3rd pull. He drove it out of the shop into the Kentucky June morning and drove it down the county road in front of his property for about a mile, feeling the machine under him, the responsiveness of the hydraulics and the steadiness of the engine and the specific quality of a machine that has been rebuilt correctly, which is a quality that is not simply the absence of malfunction but the presence of a rightness in the way the machine moves and responds, a rightness that communicates itself to the operator through the seat and the wheel and the pedals in a way that is distinct from the rightness of new equipment, and that is, in Roy's experience, superior to it in the specific sense that the rightness has been verified by the man doing the operating. He knew every system in the machine. He had put every system in the machine back together with his own hands. There was no part of the Super M's operation that was opaque to him, no sound it could make that he could not identify and address, no failure mode it had that he did not know the response to. Don Weatherly, who was working his field that morning and who stopped his tractor to watch Roy drive past on the Super M, said nothing. He watched the machine go down the road and come back and turn into Roy's driveway, and he went back to his own field work. The following week, Roy drove the Super M to the field and began the spring cultivation that had been waiting for the tractor to be finished. The machine worked the way a properly rebuilt machine works, which is without drama, without the small malfunctions that an unrebuilt machine of that age would have produced, without anything to report except the completion of the work on the schedule the field required. The summer of 1974 established the rhythm of the Super M's service on Roy Callahan's farm, a rhythm that did not change in any fundamental way for the next 25 years. The machine worked the 87 acres through the growing seasons, and Roy serviced it on a schedule. Monthly oil change, grease fittings, belt tension, coolant check, hydraulic fluid level, a schedule he had established from the service manual during the rebuild, and that he kept, as he kept all commitments to mechanical systems, without exception and without postponement. The maintenance schedule that Roy had established in 1974 from the service manual was not a schedule he regarded as optional or approximate. It was a commitment, the same kind of commitment he made to the soil when he decided what it needed and applied what he decided. A commitment to doing the specific thing at the specific interval, because the specific thing at the specific interval was what the machine required, and he had verified that through the rebuild's intimacy with every system. He serviced the Super M on the first Saturday of every month when it was in active use, and he serviced it every 2 months in the winter when it was not in active use. Because a machine that sits without service is a machine that is slowly accumulating the small deteriorations that become large problems. The monthly service took about 90 minutes and consisted of the oil change, the grease fittings, the belt tension check, the fluid levels, the coolant condition, the filter inspection, and a walk around looking at anything the past month's use had produced that needed attention. He recorded every service in the equipment notebook, the same notebook system he kept for every piece of equipment on the farm, with the date and the service performed, and any observation from the inspection that was worth tracking. The observations built, over years, into a specific picture of the machine's wear patterns, and the wear patterns were what told him, long before any system failed, that a component was approaching its service limit and needed attention. The machine produced no major failures in the first 5 years. This was not luck. It was the result of the rebuild having been done to specification, the service having been done on schedule, and Roy's specific attention to the sounds and responses of the machine that allowed him to identify and address minor issues before they became major ones. He replaced the water pump in 1977 when it began to show the specific weep that precedes a seal failure. Not after the seal failed, but before, because the weep was detectable and the replacement was simple, and the cost of proactive replacement was trivial compared to the cost of a failure at a critical moment. He replaced the magneto in 1979 with a rebuilt unit when the output began to drop below the threshold that good starting required. He replaced the hydraulic pump again in 1982, this time with a unit he rebuilt himself from a kit, because he had by that point rebuilt the pump once before and knew the procedure and trusted his own work. He replaced the tires again in 1984, when the sidewalls on the 1974 tires had developed the cracking that indicates age beyond reliable service. Each of these replacements was a specific decision made from the record of the machine's condition, not from the calendar and not from general practice, but from the actual state of the actual component on the actual machine, read by a man who knew the machine well enough to read it accurately. The neighbors, who had been around in 1974 and who had heard Don Weatherly's comment about the sorest excuse for a farm tractor, updated their assessment of the Super M gradually, over those years, in the way that community assessments update when the evidence accumulates, in a direction that the original assessment had not anticipated. By 1979, when the machine had been working Roy's ground for 5 years without a major failure, the assessment had shifted from skepticism to something closer to respectful attention. By 1984, when the machine had been working for 10 years, the assessment had shifted further to a specific kind of recognition that the men who farm in a community extend to approaches that have demonstrated their validity over time. Don Weatherly was still farming with newer equipment. He was also still farming adjacent to Roy Callahan, and the two of them had the relationship that farming neighbors have. Cooperative in the ways that farm neighbors are cooperative. Sharing equipment when one operation had something the other needed temporarily. And in conversation about the farming decisions that each of them was making. In the fall of 1980, Don asked Roy what he had spent on the Super M over the years since the rebuild. Roy went home and looked at the record he kept, because he kept a record of every expenditure on every piece of equipment, and added it up. He came back the next day with the number, which was $812 in parts and materials over 6 years of operation, not including the original rebuild cost, which he had tracked separately. Don looked at that number for a moment. He said he had spent more than that on a single repair to his primary tractor the previous season. Roy said he knew. He had heard about the repair. Don said he had not thought the rebuild was a sound decision in 1974. Roy said he understood that. He said the surface of the machine in 1974 had not been encouraging. Don said the surface was not the machine. Roy said that was exactly right. They talked for a while about what the machine's condition in 1974 had actually meant, about the difference between the visible condition of a machine that has been sitting for 8 years and the actual condition of its fundamental systems, about the way that surface deterioration and mechanical deterioration are different processes that do not necessarily track together, and about how a man who knows how to read the difference between those two things can find value where a man who reads only the surface cannot. This conversation was one of the more useful conversations Roy had about farming in those years. Not because it told him anything he did not already know, but because it confirmed that the distinction he had been operating on was understood by a man he respected, which is a different kind of knowing. The Super M worked Roy's ground through the 1980s. The farm crisis years were difficult in the specific way that they were difficult for every farm operation. The margin compression and the input cost pressure and the commodity price softening that affected everyone regardless of their equipment or their management. Roy's operation was not exposed to the debt pressure that some of his neighbors were exposed to, partly because the 87 acres were paid for by the early 1980s and partly because the cost structure of the operation had been kept lean in the specific way that running rebuilt equipment keeps a cost structure lean. But the market conditions were still adverse, and the adverse conditions required the specific management attention of a lean operation going through a lean time. The Super M's contribution to getting through those years was not dramatic. It was simply that it did not add to the difficulty. It continued to work the ground and be serviced and work the ground again. And the absence of any significant mechanical crisis during the farm crisis years was not nothing. Roy estimated, in a conversation with Ellen in the winter of 1985, that the decision to rebuild the Super M instead of financing the 666 had saved the operation something between $6,000 and $8,000 over the preceding decade. including the financing costs avoided, the repair costs avoided through the proactive maintenance approach, and the lower operating costs of a machine whose systems were known and whose maintenance requirements were fully within Roy's own capability to address. $6,000 to $8,000 on an 87-acre operation in Mercer County, Kentucky, over 10 years was not an insignificant sum. The conversation with Ellen in the winter of 1985 was one of the more complete conversations Roy and Ellen had about the farm's financial history, which was a topic they revisited periodically in the way that farming families revisit their major decisions, not with regret, but with the specific accounting that tells you whether the decisions were right and by how much. They had been through the worst of the farm crisis period by 1985 and were coming out of it in the condition that operations built on lean foundations come out of difficult periods, reduced in income from the better years, but intact in the fundamental sense of owning the ground they farmed and owning the equipment they farmed with, and owing nothing to anyone that they could not comfortably service from the operation's income. The $6,000 to $8,000 estimate Roy gave for the cumulative value of the rebuild decision was conservative in a specific sense that he was aware of. It did not include the value of the reliability, the absence of the critical moment, failures that the single machine operations with newer equipment had experienced and that had cost them yield and income in years when yield and income were already under pressure. It counted only the direct financial comparison, the avoided financing cost and the lower repair cost, and left out the operational value of a machine that its operator knew completely and that therefore produced fewer surprises and more predictable results in the field. Including the operational value would have made the estimate larger. Roy had left it out because he could not put a precise number on it, and he did not want to argue from an imprecise number. Ellen said she had always thought the rebuild was the right decision. Roy said he had not been certain of it in April of 1974, when he had brought the machine home on the borrowed trailer. Ellen said that was the thing about right decisions, that you usually weren't certain when you made them. He thought about that for a while, and then said she was probably right. In 1991, the Super M turned 39 years old, and Roy Callahan rebuilt it again. Not because it had failed, not because it was producing unreliable service, but because the 17 years since the first rebuild had accumulated enough systems that a systematic rebuild was more sensible than the piecemeal replacement of individual components as they reached their service limits. He went through the engine again, finding it in substantially better condition than it had been in 1974, because the intervening 17 years of operation had been operation under conditions of proper maintenance rather than neglect. He replaced the components that showed wear, rebuilt the ones that were serviceable, and left in place the components that the inspection said had life remaining. The 1991 rebuild cost him $1,100 in parts and 6 weekends, more than the 1974 rebuild in both measures, but substantially less than any newer machine would have cost in either the purchase or the operating sense. The second rebuild, in 1991, differed from the first in a way that Roy had not expected before he began it, which was that the 1991 rebuild was in some respects easier because of what the 1974 rebuild had taught him. Not easier in the physical sense, because pulling an engine and rebuilding it is the same physical work, regardless of how many times you have done it. Easier in the sense of certainty, of knowing before he encountered each system what that system would show and what it would require. The 1974 rebuild had been done with the confidence of a man who had done the arithmetic, and believed the assessment was correct. The 1991 rebuild was done with the confidence of a man who had operated the machine for 17 years and who had accumulated in that time a specific and detailed knowledge of what this machine wore, at what rate, and what it needed when. The 1991 inspection confirmed everything he expected and found nothing he had not anticipated. That was the result of 17 years of attention. He drove the machine out of the shop after the second rebuild with the same feeling he had driven it out after the first. The specific confidence of a man who has taken something apart and understood it and put it back together correctly and knows that it will do what he is asking it to do because he knows what it is. There is a specific quality to the knowledge that a man develops about a machine he has operated and maintained for 20 years, and it is worth describing because it is different from the knowledge of a machine that is known through documentation or through occasional contact. The documentation knowledge is abstract. It tells you what a machine's specifications are, what its designed service intervals are, what its typical failure modes are as a class. This is useful knowledge. It is the starting point for the specific knowledge. The specific knowledge is what you know about this machine, not the class, but the unit. The individual machine with its individual history and its individual wear patterns and its individual responses to specific conditions. You know that this engine runs slightly rich at cold start and leans out to normal mixture at operating temperature, and that the carburetor adjustment that produces the best power at temperature produces a cold start that requires the choke held slightly longer than the procedure specifies. You know this because you have started this engine 500 times and you have adjusted the carburetor 4 times over 20 years, and each adjustment has changed the cold start behavior in a specific way you observed and remembered. You know that the steering is slightly stiffer in cold weather than in warm weather, not from any defect, but from the specific viscosity response of the steering box grease in the temperature range that Mercer County produces in November and December, and that, allowing a few extra minutes of warm-up time in cold weather, addresses this without any intervention. You know these things because you have been paying attention for 20 years, and because the attention has accumulated into a specific knowledge of a specific machine that cannot be transferred to a different machine or acquired from any document. Roy Callahan had that knowledge of the Super M by 1994. David Callahan was acquiring it. The Super M continued to work Roy's ground through the 1990s. Roy's son, David, who had grown up on the farm and who had been helping with field work since he was old enough to be useful, drove the Super M regularly through those years and developed the same relationship with the machine that Roy had developed, the specific knowledge of a machine that has been lived with long enough, that its responses are familiar and its needs are understood without requiring diagnosis. David had watched both rebuilds, the first when he was too young to be significantly useful, and the second when he was capable of doing much of the work himself. He had read the service manual alongside his father during the second rebuild, going through the procedure for each system before they addressed it, asking the questions that made the procedure clear before the work began rather than during it. The transmission of the knowledge from Roy to David had happened in 2 distinct phases, the first through observation and the second through participation. David had watched the 1974 rebuild from a distance. Because he was 7 years old, and the shop was not a place for a 7-year-old to be underfoot during a rebuild, but he had understood, at the level a 7-year-old understands, that the change from seized and silent to running was the result of his father's specific work on specific components in a specific sequence. He had participated in the maintenance from the time he was 10, learning the monthly service sequence by doing it alongside Roy, not watching, but doing each step himself, while Roy observed and corrected and explained the reason for each step. He had participated fully in the 1991 rebuild, doing the work under Roy's direction with the careful attention the machine deserved. By 1995, David knew the Super M the way Roy knew it, not with 20 years of specific knowledge behind the knowing, but with the starting knowledge that is the foundation that 20 years builds on. Roy had taught David the same way he had taught himself, which was through the combination of reading and doing, the procedure read from the manual and then applied to the actual machine. The gap between the procedure, as described, and the procedure as actually performed on a specific machine identified through the doing and addressed through additional reading or through the phone calls to the man in Cincinnati who still restored old farm equipment and who was still generous with his knowledge. The man in Cincinnati, whose name was Walter Grimes, had become over the years something more than a technical resource. He had become a person Roy called when the technical question was answered and there was still something worth talking about, which is the kind of relationship that develops between people who share a specific and somewhat unusual interest and who have both been serious about it for long enough that the conversations are genuinely productive. Walter had been rebuilding Farmall M and Super M tractors since 1962 and had restored and returned to service more than 40 machines by the time Roy first called him in 1974. He said, in one of their later conversations, that the Super M was the most well-designed piece of agricultural equipment he had worked with in 30 years of restoration, that it had been designed to last by people who understood what lasting meant in the context of farm equipment and who had built that understanding into the design in ways that were still paying off 40 years after the machines were made. Roy said he agreed with that assessment from his own experience with the one machine he knew well. Walter said one machine known well was worth more than 10 machines known casually. Roy wrote that down. The spring of 1999 was the 25th anniversary of the Super M's return to service on Roy Callahan's 87 acres in Mercer County, Kentucky. The equipment record that marked the 25th anniversary was the 63rd monthly entry in the 1999 section of the notebook. The notation, simple and factual. The date and the service performed, and the observation that all systems were within normal parameters and no way attention was required beyond the scheduled items. He had written 63 of those entries in 1999, one at the beginning of each month, and approximately 1,600 entries before that across 25 years of monthly service on the Super M. 1,600 and some entries, each one taking about 10 minutes to complete. The recording of the date and the work done and the observation, the accumulation of which was the complete service history of the machine from the day it left the barn in 1974 to the present. The complete service history was in the notebook. The notebook was in the kitchen office filing cabinet, in the section dedicated to the Super M, which was thicker than the sections for any other piece of equipment because the Super M had been on the farm longer than any other piece of equipment, and because Roy had been keeping that specific notebook since the rebuild began. He looked at the notebook on the 25th anniversary and turned through the pages, not reading each entry, but looking at the accumulation of them. The 500 and some pages of monthly service records. The record of what he had done and what the machine had said in return. The conversation between a man and a machine conducted in the language of service and response across 25 years. Roy noted this in his equipment record on the specific date, not with ceremony, but with the simple notation that a man makes when a date has meaning and the meaning deserves to be recorded. The Super M was 47 years old in 1999. It had been in service on Roy's farm for 25 of those years. It had worked through 9 presidential administrations and the farm crisis and the commodity price cycles of the 1980s and 1990s, and the changes in the Kentucky agricultural landscape that those years had produced. It had worked through Roy's children growing up, and his father-in-law, James Hartley's death, and Ellen's health difficulties in the early 1990s, and the expansion of the farm from 87 acres to 112 when the adjacent parcel became available in 1888, and Roy bought it with the cash that the lean cost structure of the operation had made available. The machine had outlasted 3 of the newer tractors that Don Weatherly had run in the adjacent fields over the same period, each of which had served its years and been replaced in the ordinary cycle of equipment on a well-capitalized operation, each of which Roy had watched come and go while the Super M continued. Don Weatherly retired in 1997 when he was 72, and sold his farm to a younger farmer from the county who had ambitions that required more ground than he had inherited. On the day Don retired, he drove over to Roy's farm on the last of his equipment, a 1990 International 5120 that the new owner would take with the farm, and he sat in Roy's kitchen for an hour. The conversation in Roy's kitchen in 1997 was the most direct thing Don Weatherly had ever said to Roy about the equipment decision of 1974, and it deserved to be received with the same directness with which it was offered. Roy said he remembered Don's comment from the road in 1974 when the Super M had come home on the borrowed trailer. He said he had heard it clearly and had thought about it during the first few weeks of the rebuild, during the moments of uncertainty that any significant project produces, when the question of whether the decision was right is most present. Don said he had meant what he said in 1974. He said the machine had looked like exactly what he had called it, and that he had not expected it to become what it became. Roy said that was the thing about the machine. It had not looked like what it was. Don said that was the thing about a lot of things. They sat with that for a moment. Then Don said that what he had noticed over the years was not primarily the tractor itself, though the tractor was what he noticed first and most visibly. What he had noticed was the approach, the specific way that Roy had engaged with the machine from the beginning, the way he had evaluated it before deciding, and the way he had rebuilt it, and the way he had maintained it, and the way he had talked about it in the years since, always in specific terms rather than general ones, always from the position of a man who knew the specific machine rather than the general type. He said that approach was the thing, not the tractor. Roy said he thought that was right. He said something that Roy had not expected from Don, who was not a man who reconsidered his positions easily or expressed that reconsideration to the person whose position had turned out to be the right one. He said he had been farming for 50 years and he had bought and paid for and worn out more tractors than he wanted to count, and the one tractor he had watched most closely over those years, because it was next door and because of the way it had started, was the one that was still in Roy's shed. He said he had thought in 1974 that Roy was making a mistake, and that the mistake had lasted 25 years, which was the longest-running mistake he had ever seen. He said it with a tone that made clear he was not describing a mistake. Roy said he appreciated that, and meant it, because it had come from Don Weatherly, who did not say things like that easily. What the Super M represents, in the fuller account of what Roy Callahan built on those 87 and then 112 acres in Mercer County over 50 years of farming, is not primarily a story about a tractor. It is a story about a way of engaging with the things you depend on, about the specific quality of attention that turns a machine from a tool into a known quantity, and about what that attention produces over the time span that farming operates in, which is not seasons, but decades. The farming community in Mercer County that had heard Don Weatherly's comment in 1974 and had processed it as a fair description of what Roy was bringing home had spent 25 years watching the machine work, and what they had watched was not a story of triumph over adversity or a dramatic vindication of the underdog approach. What they had watched was more ordinary and more significant than that, which was a man doing the work of farming consistently and well with a machine he understood completely, and the machine responding to that consistency and that understanding by continuing to work. That is what machines do when they are treated that way. That is what the article in the Farm magazine had said, and what Walter Grimes had confirmed from 30 years of restoration work, and what Roy had demonstrated on one specific machine, on one specific farm, in one specific Kentucky county, for 25 years and counting. One machine known well, worth more than 10 machines known casually. Roy wrote it down because Walter Grimes said it, and because it was true, and because true things that you write down are more likely to be carried forward than true things that you only hear. David knows it without having written it down. It went into him the way the things that matter go into a son who has been paying attention. The Super M is still in service. Roy is 73 now, and he does not do the heavy field work that he did in the years when the farm was his primary occupation. But the machine is maintained on the schedule that was established in 1974 and has not been varied from since, and it is started and run regularly because Roy Callahan is not a man who allows things he has built to deteriorate from neglect. David manages the farm now. He maintains the Super M on the same schedule Roy established. He services it with the same attention to what the machine is actually telling him. Not what the calendar says is due, but what the specific systems of the specific machine say they need. Because that is what Roy taught him, and what Walter Grimes's conversation confirmed, which is that the machine will tell you what it needs if you know how to listen, and have been paying attention long enough that the listening is accurate. The Super M was 47 years old in 1999, which was when Don Weatherly came to Roy's kitchen and said what he said. It is 71 years old now. It has been in service on the same Mercer County, Kentucky farm for the better part of 50 years, maintained by 2 generations of the same family with the same philosophy and the same schedule and the same understanding of what the maintenance is for. It runs, not because old iron is magic, not because the Farmall Super M was the finest piece of agricultural engineering ever produced, which it was not. It runs because a man in 1974 looked at a machine that everyone else had given up on and asked a different question than the question everyone else was asking. Everyone else was asking what the machine looked like. Roy Callahan asked what the machine was. The answer to the second question was different from the answer to the first question, and the difference was 25 years of service from a tractor that the neighbor said was the sorriest excuse for a farm tractor he had seen since the war. 25 years, and still running. The men who heard Don Weatherly's comment in 1974 and who had updated their assessment of the Super M gradually through the 25 years since, had been watching something more than a tractor work its way through the seasons. They had been watching a man's relationship with a machine develop from the careful evaluation of a seized and damaged piece of equipment in a barn to the 25-year record of service that the 1999 anniversary represented. The relationship had started with a question. Roy had asked the question that gave a different answer than Don Weatherly's question. The question about what the machine was, rather than what the machine looked like. And the asking of the right question had led to the rebuild, and the rebuild had led to the knowledge, and the knowledge had led to the 25 years. The men watching had absorbed some of this understanding through proximity and observation, in the way that farming communities absorb the lessons of their successful members, not through formal instruction, but through the accumulation of evidence that builds the community's sense of what works and what does not. They had absorbed that a machine's surface condition and its actual condition are not the same thing, and that reading the difference requires a specific kind of looking. They had absorbed that a rebuilt machine maintained on schedule produces service that compares favorably with newer equipment at a fraction of the cost if the rebuild is done correctly. They had absorbed that knowing a machine completely, from having taken it apart and put it back together, produces an operational relationship that is different in quality from the operational relationship with a machine that is used but not understood. These were things Roy Callahan had known before he read the article in January of 1974, known, at least in the intuitive form that precedes articulation. The article and the arithmetic and the phone call to Walter Grimes had given the intuitive knowledge a specific and confirmable form, and the rebuild and the 25 years of service had given the specific and confirmable form the proof it required. The Super M is still in service, still running, 25 years and more, on the same Mercer County, Kentucky farm, maintained by the same family, with the same attention and the same schedule and the same understanding of what the maintenance is for. The machine is 71 years old now. Roy Callahan is 73. He starts it once a month in the shop, because that is the schedule, and the schedule is what he has kept for 50 years, and what he will keep as long as he is able to keep it. It starts every time. That is the whole of what Don Weatherly was describing when he came to Roy's kitchen in 1997, and said what he said about the longest-running mistake he had ever seen. He was not describing a mistake. He was describing something that ran. There is a detail from the 1974 rebuild that Roy mentioned in several conversations over the years. A detail that is small enough to be overlooked, but that represents something significant about how the rebuild was approached. When he was going through the engine the first weekend, after the block had come back from the machine shop, and before he began reassembly, he went through the service manual one more time from the beginning, not reading the whole manual but reading the section on assembly sequence and torque specifications. He had read it twice before, during the planning phase and during the teardown, but he read it again before reassembly because he was aware that the information he had read before, read in the context of planning and of working on a seized engine, was not necessarily the same information he would read in the context of assembling a properly machined engine, where the specifications mattered in a way they had not mattered before. He found, on the third reading, a note in the assembly section about the main bearing cap torque sequence that he had not retained from the previous readings, a specific order for tightening the main caps that the manual indicated was important for consistent bearing load distribution. He had been planning to tighten them in the order that felt natural, which was not the order the manual specified. He tightened them in the order the manual specified. He would never be able to say with certainty whether that specific torque sequence made a difference to the engine's longevity over 25 years. But he knew he had done it right, and knowing he had done it right was itself part of the foundation of the confidence with which he drove the machine out of the shop in June of 1974. Right. Things done right for the right reasons. That is the whole philosophy. That is what still runs. Walter Grimes, the man in Cincinnati who had been the phone call resource through both rebuilds and the 20 years between them, died in 2003. The same year that Roy turned 67, Roy learned about it through the Association of Farmall Restorers that Walter had helped found in the early 1980s, and that had grown into a national organization with several hundred members by the time of Walter's death. Roy wrote a letter to the association when he heard, not a long letter, but a specific one, describing what Walter had provided in the 4 calls during the first rebuild and the subsequent calls over 20 years, the specific technical knowledge and the patient willingness to share it, and the sentence about one machine, known well-being, worth more than 10 machines, known casually, which Roy had written down and which David had learned without writing it down, because some things go in through the ears rather than the hands. The association published the letter in its newsletter. Roy did not know they had published it until a man from Indiana called him in the spring of 2004 to say that he had read the letter, and that it described exactly the thing he had been trying to articulate about his own experience with a restored Farmall M, and that he was grateful for the articulation. Roy said he was glad it was useful. The man from Indiana asked if the Super M was still running. Roy said it was. The man said he thought it would be. They talked for about 30 minutes about the specific maintenance challenges of the C264 engine in its later years of service and about the parts availability situation in 2004 for machines of that vintage, which was more favorable than Roy had expected because the restored equipment community had produced a secondary market in correctly manufactured replacement parts that had not existed in 1974. When Roy hung up, he went to the shop and started the Super M, which started on the second pull, and stood in the shop and listened to it run for a while. He thought about Walter Grimes, who had told him in 1974 that the machine could serve him for 5 years, and who had been right about that, and who was no longer there to be told that it had served him for 30 and was still going. He would have been glad to know it. Roy was glad to know it. He shut the engine off, recorded the monthly service in the notebook, and went in for lunch. The machine was right. Everything was right. That is what it means to have done something correctly from the beginning, and kept it correctly for as long as you have kept it. It is right, still running.